Am I making the Tome of Beasts my first Home Sweet Homebrew review because my brother got me the physical copy of it recently? Yep. Home Sweet Homebrew reviews. Tome of Beasts. Over 400 pages of content, and I love it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Tome of Beasts is a gigantic homebrew book created by a team called Kobold Press. It's, at its core, a big bestiary, some sort of ultra-powerful Supreme Deluxe Director's Cut monster manual. Now that we all know what it is, let's get into the specifics. First of all, this book is gorgeous. Respecting what D&D books created by Wizard of the Coast look like, veterans will not get lost in the aesthetic. Down to the color schemes, placement of text, and the overall design choices, it incorporates itself within the rest of the library pretty seamlessly. I also have to address the absolutely gorgeous artworks. Every entry is presented beautifully. You can feel what kind of attitude each creature has by the way they are drawn, be it shy, aggressive, ethereal, mysterious, or exuding a regal aroma. All give the artistic side of this book a seal of approval. On the other hand, the physical copy is definitely made cheaper than Wizard of the Coast's books, but I would attribute it to a smaller budget and the sheer size of it. Nonetheless, it feels solid, and I'd even say I prefer the texture of the page from Wizards, but that's far from what is important about this book. To me, homebrew content needs to be able to fit into a world easily. Establishing complex lore with unending details, or being too vague or two ends of the spectrum to avoid. Too many times have I looked at a homebrew creation and felt there was no way I could slip it into my own universe without major revisions. The Tome of Beasts is not like that at all. Not only are their original creations intriguing, with only a few misses for me, they include a lot of creatures that extend content already present within Wizard of the Coast's work. A perfect example would be the several ghouls. From beggars to emperors, you have a nice addition that could even form a society, which the text obviously hint towards. Another is, as obvious as it is, the arrival of several types of dragons and drakes. Wind, void, mithril, sea, and so many others that really bring out the dragons in Dungeons and Dragons. Other than extra variants, which are enough to satisfy a DM for the rest of their lives, there's also a sudden breath of fresh air that comes from this tome. A lot of creatures detaching themselves from what we've seen a lot in 5e. I miss that a lot from the extra contents in 3.5, that included a lot of twists on things we had seen before. Different ways of handling undead was my personal favorite kind of additional content of that era. Tome of Beasts includes a lot of different ways to present creatures as obstacles, NPCs, or world-building tools. Maybe with mechanics, such as the Fate Eater's ability to affect characters' ability scores permanently, or the Skyne's Witch power over time and fate, being able to reverse someone's death by asking the players themselves how they think they'll die. Wild, right? We could also talk more lore-wise, with creatures such as the Emerald Eye, a small sentient construct of magic that uses other creatures to move it, since it cannot move by itself, ultimately a being of betrayal. Or, we could talk about one of my favorites, the Aeonic Drifters, who are time travelers looking for any help they can in different times to save their quickly falling kingdom, but find the journey back home to be more difficult than intended. The lore within is also clever in its presentation. Similar to some creatures of the official material, the Tome of Beasts gives ideas on how a monster can be introduced. They'll mention the ways a creature hunts, or what it derives pleasure from, they'll mention where it lives and how it protects itself, their favorite prey, or even just the fate they participate in. All of this is why I find them easy to include anywhere. Because they are detailed but not precise, they'll come from a falling kingdom, but it's without a name. They'll collect humans for dark sacrifices, but to whom? That's where the DM may include the piece that connects them to their own campaign, and that was handed to them by a few lines in the book. The book also references Midgard, which is a universe created by Kobold Press. I'll put a link down in the description for anyone interested. They seem to be quite thorough of that world they've made. It shows in how much they connected to the Tome of Beasts, or I guess the opposite in this case. There's obviously too much for me to ramble about every single thing this book contains, and discovering them is ultimately part of the journey as a DM or a D&D enthusiast overall. At least that's why I keep coming back to this book. But for now, the Tome of Beasts is not perfect. If anything, even Wizard's content is far from perfect. I'd feel bad if I didn't acknowledge my issues with this homebrew content as well. Balancing. It seems to be quite a consistent problem throughout this book. To anyone using it, I try to consider every enemy as being much more difficult than their CR suggests, usually by 1 or 2 points higher. Be it for damage, raw numbers, abilities, etc., creatures of the Tome of Beasts are just really strong. Perhaps it's just that the monster manual's creatures are weak, but I'd keep that in mind when creating encounters. You could wreck your players by thinking these foes are balanced the same way as our dear official friends and fiends. It at least poses a challenge, if I was to look at the silver lining. Definitely been useful against my players who are absolute beasts. If anything, I'm starting to wonder if that's really a flaw. Another issue is the presence of what I call monster for the sake of monster. Creatures that honestly just seem like someone went, what if I made an animal but weird? That's good, right? Wizard also does this to some extent, but for Tome of Beasts, the Child of the Briar, for example, I'd honestly just call a reskin of something else from the monster manual, this one being quite close to the Blights. Some others feel like padding to get an impressive number, not carrying themselves at what the book has set as a standard. Right next to the Aeonic Drifter, I'd be lying if I didn't find the Strix to be underwhelming, to say the least. It's just an owl with a mouth. I could just use the owl stat block and add a mouth, and its lore doesn't help it much either. Others are just not to my preference, I guess. And with that out of the way, this book is a harem. So many creatures are falling into the I'm totally not a dangerous creature hidden under the guise of a supermodel. At this point, I'm worried for groups that would fall for this trick. Like, really? How could I fall for them? It's so easy to see that they're evil. Okay, never mind, I get it. Would I recommend Tome of Beasts? Absolutely. I don't like giving a number rating, so I'd simply call this a must-have for lovers of homebrew. Despite the issues I've raised, I still think a big chunk of this book is wonderful and very well executed. In fact, I'd say most of this book is a hit. One day, I would love to go more in depth, giving short reviews of all the creatures. But I shall wait. For now, I'll leave you with one of my favorite monsters, the Cambium. Unfolding impossibly from beneath voluminous robes, this creature's pockmarked, spindly arms end in clusters of narrow spikes. Its long, hollow needle-like fingers and its many jointed arms move with surprising speed and strength for such an emaciated creature. The Cambium skulks through mortal society, hunched and contorted, concealing its 9-foot height in its supernumerary arms. The source of Cambium's interest lies in every mortal body, the 4 humors, which it drains in precise amounts, sometimes to fix its own imbalances, sometimes to concoct serums meant for sale in hellish markets. Its victims are left in a desperate state, eager for a corrective fix, and willing to obey the Cambium's every whim as servants and toadies. After a sufficient crop has been harvested, the Cambium abandons these addicts to die slowly from violent withdrawals, and allows the local population to lie fallow for a decade or so.